had the choice or the freedom to decide whether they wanted to participate or not. They didn't have that choice. It was the king's decree. And these young women were compelled to enter into this contest or face the consequences for refusing. And of course that would include consequences that would be passed on to their families as well. Now understand, the only qualifications for all the contestants were they had to be young, they had to be beautiful, and they had to be virgins. Now, having said that, the king wasn't concerned about their intelligence. He didn't care about their abilities. He didn't care about their family backgrounds. He wasn't concerned about who they connected to. You just had to look good. That was the requirement. There was only one judge, and the king was the judge, and his decision was final. And if you didn't meet his requirements, then you were consigned to living in his harem with all the unsuccessful candidates. Now, having said that, the king would provide you with everything you could think of to make yourself beautiful, and then he would evaluate your performance based on whether you were good in bed. That's basically what it came down to. As Josephus has recorded, there were over 400 young women throughout the 127 Persian provinces. They were all compelled to participate in this contest. And when you think about it, 400 to 1 that you would be selected as the queen. Not exactly an exciting prospect for any of these young ladies to think that out of all these women all contesting, there would only be one winner and the rest would be consigned to his harem. What a future to look forward to. But as I said, they had no say really in what transpired here. In the presentation in verses 16 and 17a, we see, so Esther was taken to King Xerxes in the royal palace in the 10th month, the month of Tebeth, during Xerxes' 7th reign or year as king. Now what we're told is Xerxes was pleased with Esther more than any of the other young women. In other words, he liked her better than all the others. And this presentation was the time, I guess, where Esther had to face the music. It was her turn to spend the night with the king, and it was her turn to please him in his bed. Now, our text gives the date and the month she was presented to the king as a prospective candidate for the position of queen. Now, our text does not say whether she was number 30th or whether she was number 300. It simply says that of all the other young women who had gone before her, she was the only one that the king liked and remembered. Now, you and I might not approve of this selection process, but there is a principle here that Esther was chosen and approved based upon who she was. She was chosen because of her beauty alone. And what I'm talking here is about her natural beauty was what won the day for her. She was a beautiful young woman, and this is what appealed to Xerxes as the king. The pinnacle. So he put a crown on her head and made her queen in place of Vashti. She had reached the pinnacle, if you like. She was now Queen of Persia. Once again, this young woman was in unfamiliar territory. She had never been a queen before. She'd been an orphan, brought up by her uncle. Here she is, replacing Vashti as queen. She probably was thinking, what does the future hold for me now? What are the odds that a young Jewish woman whose parents had died, a young woman who'd been raised by Uncle Mordecai, would become queen of one of the most powerful nations of earth? What are the odds about being chosen out of 400 candidates? What chance would you give her? And yet, if we realise and understand, this has nothing to do with luck. God had taken a bad situation. He'd put his handprints over everything that had happened in Esther's life to now put her in a position where she could protect his people. Now, she didn't know that. Mordecai didn't know that. But God had been working all through these events that had taken place. You know, life can be difficult. Life can be uncertain at different times. You know, there's no such thing as a straight line in life. There's a lot of twists. There's a lot of turns. And one thing I like about the territory, there is long straight roads for a long, long while. But there are some curves. There are some twists. Sometimes there are some detours. And life is like that. There's twists and turns and detours. And we can find ourselves in situations where things are desperate, where things are out of our control, and we are wondering what's going to happen next. As believers, we have the assurance there's always somebody who is in control. We're not left to our own devices. We don't travel alone on some undetermined path. We are not left to random luck and chances or circumstances who dictate who and what we become. We know who we are. And what are we? Well, that's encouraging. As you sit here tonight, who are you? You're a child of God, aren't you? So what does the future hold for you? Is it bright? It is, isn't it? There might be some circumstances that we might not like, but there's no doubt about our future. There's no doubt about our destination. We belong to God, and He will see us through this life and the next, and He provides us with everything that we need for the journey. And whatever place or position we find ourselves in, He'll use us to accomplish His plans. God uses us here and now, wherever we are. There's a proclamation. Then the king gave a great banquet for Esther and invited all his important men and royal officers. He announced a holiday for all the empire and had the government give away gifts. I like this king. He's really generous with the people's money. He was so pleased with Esther, he held a great feast and introduced her to his subjects. He introduced her to all the elites of society and says, here's your queen. He even went and proclaimed a royal holiday. So everybody throughout the empire had a holiday to honour his queen. You know, Xerxes was a party animal, and money was no expense, and he spared it none. He didn't limit himself. As far as he was concerned, this was another good opportunity to celebrate. He was in a generous mood. He lavished gifts upon people. It's said that he even freed some of the prisoners. He was in such a good mood. Life was as good as you can get it as far as the king was concerned. He had plenty of cash to spread around, and so he celebrated. Now, as we look at the incident, you and I might not agree with the methods that these pagan rulers, men in power, used, but I cannot help but see the hand of God moving throughout the book of Esther, pulling strings this way and that way. You know, like a giant jigsaw puzzle, the pieces are being put in place, just ready for the next move. You know, God hasn't changed today. He's still the same as He always has. Yesterday, today, and forever. He's in control of this world. He's in control of all the global events, and might I say, global warming, climate change, you want to name whatever they're going to come up with next. He's in control of it all, and he's in control of our lives. So that means we remain secure, we remain significant, and we can know that we're in the right place where we can be used by God and allow him to use us to accomplish his purposes. In verses 19 and 20, I have called it the place of submission. And there's so much confusion, so much debate over this word, submission. What is it? What isn't it? What is submission? That's one. Why do we have such a problem with submission? People don't like that word. But if you look at most dictionary meanings, you'll find they'll say something like the action of fact of accepting or yielding to a superior force or to the will or authority of another person. That's the basic idea that's here. In the Greek language, the word for submit is upatasso, and it means to arrange under, to be subordinate, to submit to one's control, to yield to one's advice. That is the idea of submission. Now, some say submission means putting others before yourself, but not always doing what you want to do, putting God's desire above your own desires. Yet, biblical submission is a choice. Just like when Jesus made the choice to lay down his life for our sake. No one forced him to surrender his will, but he chose to because he wanted to do so. Our text reveals that God had a plan for Esther and Mordecai's lives. And while they were not party to all the details that were going on, he was already paving the way, or if you like, setting the foundation for his plan to succeed. And as we will see, God was paving the way for Mordecai to find favour with Xerxes, long before he secured a position of power within the palace where he could be used to save his people. So God is at work behind the scenes, pulling strings, making events, people and places come together for the preservation of his people. Now, it required everybody in this narrative in Esther submitting their attitudes, submitting their actions to his plans so they could succeed. And in Esther and Mordecai, their roles were played to perfection, just as Xerxes and Haman played their roles so that God's plan could be effective. We see the position in verse 19. Now Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate when the girls were gathered the second time. As we look at this verse, we don't see much happening, but what is about to take place will have a huge bearing on what has happened to the Jewish people. We've looked at the Miss Persia beauty pageant where the king judged 400 beautiful young girls to select one who would become his queen. Now, going through the process, he chose Esther, who he loved more than any of the other girls, to be his wife and queen. But our text, it seems that it didn't stop Xerxes from having a second selection process from those whom he shortlisted, showing us how confused about love he was, because he was more preoccupied with them than with Esther. Now, many Jewish expositors say this was a conspiracy of some sort, cooked up by some of those in positions within the palace who were not accepting of Esther as queen, and so they orchestrated these events, this new showing of these young women who would keep the king occupied so that Esther would fade into the background and maybe even be replaced by someone who the king liked more than Esther. it's at least interesting. If you like, it's one of those intriguing mysteries in palace life. You know, all the intrigue and the goings-on, the place for power, usurping the authority, deals made. You never know who's backing who and who's twisting the knife in somebody else to get ahead. But you can understand the tensions that maybe were happening within the palace. And that would explain why Mordecai was cautious and watchful. Maybe he had got wind of some rumours about unrest in the palace. That's why he's sitting at the king's gate. Mind you, he's not here in any official capacity when he's doing this, but the king's gate was a public place where people met, where conversations and rumours were discussed, and introductions and deals brokered. This was the place where you want to know something, that's where you hung out. That's where you found out all the gossip. That's where you found out and made deals, in the king's gate. And so Mordecai was keeping a watchful eye on events. He's waiting for any news from Esther, and he became familiar with the comings and goings that took place in palace life. And it wasn't by random chance or luck that he happened to be in the king's place when a subsequent event took place. God had prepared him, and he was in the right place at the right time. In verse 20, the first part, Esther still had not told anyone about her family or who her people were, just as Mordecai had commanded her. So here we have Esther as queen. She has kept her family heritage a secret. She hasn't revealed it to anyone, even though a few years had passed since she's been appointed as queen. So her husband, the king, remains ignorant about her real identity, or maybe not caring, because he was only interested in satisfying his own sexual appetites. But it's interesting. Esther managed to keep her secret from everybody around her, knowing that if this knowledge about her identity became public, it could prove disastrous. If the wrong people would discover it and use it as leverage against her and the Jewish people, there would be a lot of trouble. Now, there are many people who question the reality of keeping her identity a secret, saying she should have been open, she should have been transparent about these things from the very beginning. As I've said before, it's easy for us to look back and make our judgment on what we know today. But walk in their shoes, walk in their times, and it's not as easy as what it appears today. We're not in their shoes, and we honestly don't know what we would do if we're put under the same pressure and tension as they were. Who's to say we wouldn't be guilty of the same decisions and choices as they did? You see, the morality of the people involved here is not the point of the story. It's about how God uses a bad situation for the good of his people as a whole. He worked things out when things could have been so very different. And we must understand, Esther is a grown woman. She had a husband, yet she chose to follow the instructions of her uncle rather than confide in her husband. Now, the more that I study and look at Xerxes, I wouldn't blame her. But she didn't confide in a husband. Now, the thinking is, you would think in that relationship, if she confided and revealed who she was, and he was happy with it, then he wouldn't go ahead and sign the death warrant for the Jewish people. That's the thinking. But you know what? We're not God. And we're not in that position to make those decisions. We see the next part. She obeyed Mordecai just as she had done when she was under his care. It's remarkable that Esther, as the queen of all Persia, she had the power, she had the authority over everybody, including Mordecai, if she chose to exercise her power. She had some power. But it shows us something about Esther's character. With all the pomp and ceremony of the palace, could easily have overtaken her or overwhelmed her, and she could have submitted to it and become part of it. But you know, she didn't. She understood who she was. She understood why she was in this position. She understood it wasn't her choice, and so she didn't allow herself to be caught up in all the intrigue, in all the wealth and all the pomp and ceremony of the court. She remained true to Mordecai, who raised her. She trusted him. And it shows us that special relationship that they had together. He had adopted her, raised her as his own daughter. She looked upon him as her father. She honoured and respected him and chose to remain in submission to his wishes and trusted his wisdom. In other words, here we have God taking care of business. If Esther had revealed her identity, if she revealed that Mordecai was her adopted father, then he would not have been able to sit in position before the king's gate. Add to this, as we're about to find, the conspirators that hatched the plot in the next few verses would have been more cautious and would have made sure that Mordecai was in no position to eavesdrop on their discussion because of his special relationship that he had with the queen. So it's a whole web of intrigue and secrecy. It required Mordecai to remain as a nobody. You know, somebody that nobody paid any attention to. And to be in a position to overhear the assassination attempt and report it via the queen. We see the plot shown here in verses 21 and 23. In these verses, a plot's revealed to assassinate the king. And Mordecai just happens to be sitting, quote that, just happened to be in the right place at the right time to just overhear two of the king's guards deciding they didn't like the way things were, and they were hatching a plot to do away with the king. Now, put yourself in Mordecai's position. You are overhearing these two of the king's men in trusted position, and they're hatching a plot. What do you do with this knowledge? Who do you go to? Who do you pass the information on to? What would you do? It's not as though you had some official high position in the court. And if he wanted to go and approach the king, he needed to go somebody who was over him to get that position, to be able to go and see the king. And there's no guarantee that the king could be bothered with someone of low importance. So what do you do with this information? Who do you go to? Who do you trust? And you might be thinking, just go to one of the court officials. Well, the problem with that is they might be in on it. They might be in on it. What do you do then? You've spilled the beans. So exit, stage left, if it's the wrong person. So think about the options that he had. He only had one person that he could trust, and that was Esther. So he turns to Esther and informs the king of the plot against his life. And if you think about it, who could you trust more that's got the ear of the king than his wife? So it makes sense as well to trust the Queen. Now the participants, now Bigthana and Teresh were two of the king's eunuchs who guarded the doorway. Now these were two eunuchs and they were trusted. They were given the responsibility of safeguarding and securing the sleeping quarters of the king. So basically, the king's life was in their hands. These were the two men that Mordecai heard plotting and scheming. The proof? When Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate, they became angry and began to make plans to kill King Xerxes. But Mordecai found out about their plans and told Queen Esther. Now you can picture yourself with the scene. They're in the king's thing and they must have forgotten where they were, and they'd got themselves so worked up about the king that they just didn't care who was listening. They'd come up with all these ideas. And there's been much speculation about why they're so angry with Xerxes, and some of the suggestions are interesting. Some believe that these two men were related to Queen Vashti, and so they were upset with the way the king had treated her, and they were not impressed with the selection of Esther as her replacement. Some suggested that they were angry and upset about his obsession to invade and conquer the Greeks, no matter what the cost would be. So there's got some substance. Some suggest they may have been influenced and even recruited by some officials in the palace who wanted Xerxes removed, and they knew these two men were sympathisers. They knew they were in a position to take the king out because of their positions of trust. But I want to offer this, which I found intriguing. It's tradition. It's from the Jewish tradition. It's from the Megillah. And it says these two men were complaining about not getting enough sleep because the king was sleeping with Esther every night. The king was sleeping with Esther so often, he became thirsty very often, so they're constantly having to bring him water and then take him to the toilet. It was their job to guard the door and supply any of the king's needs during the night. When he wasn't sleeping with Esther, they just guarded the door. But now that he was sleeping with her, their workload increased significantly. Since it was their job to both guard the door and provide the king's nighttime needs, they were able to have one person slip off to get poison while the other did double duty. Now I'm sure they discussed the various methods of assassination, how they would do it, how would they get away with it, how would they remove the submission from themselves. And according to Jewish tradition, they intended to put some venomous reptile in the king's cup as he was about to drink so that it would poison him. So it shows you some of the interesting suggestions about why these men were upset. I'll leave it to you to think which one you like. Mordecai just happened to be in the right place at the right time, overheard everything that was said, and went and told Esther. Now the persuasion. In verse 22, then Esther told the king how Mordecai had discovered this evil plan. So it shows the relationship between the king and queen. He was prepared to take that information from his wife seriously enough to have the matter investigated. So that there in itself showed some resemblance of trust. Now it's interesting that I found in my research that Xerxes, they didn't succeed this time, but history records for us there was a later assassination in 445 BC when Artaban, the commander of the cavalry, engaged in a plot with Mithridates, who was Xerxes' trusted chamberlain, to allow him access to the king's bedroom where he stabbed Xerxes to death while he slept. So they were not successful this time, but through a trusted person who looked after the king's bedchamber, later on, he still hadn't learned his lesson because they gained access and killed him while he slept. The pronouncement. When the report was investigated, it was found to be true. The two officers who had planned to kill the king were hanged. All of this was written down in the daily court record in the king's presence. Now, it's important for us to understand that Persian culture honoured the law. Everything that occurred was written down and done by the book. Every deed, every event was written down for posterity. So once a complaint has been made, there had to be a duty of investigation according to law. It had to be taken to the king's court in official capacity and dealt with. The two eunuchs were found guilty and hung as required by law, and then put on the official records of the king, along with Mordecai's name, for uncovering the plot against the king. So this sets up what is to follow. This experience, though, saved the life of the king. It allowed a meeting between Mordecai and the king, and Mordecai's name is in the king's official records. We go through our daily lives often without seeing the details in our life. God never forgets the details. God takes care of the details. You and I, when we get a contract, they always say, read the fine print. How many people look at the fine print and study it page after page to see what it says? We don't usually do that. But God is interested in the details, and He's working on preparing our future. The insignificant details of our lives may well prove beneficial for our future. We tend to view God as one who is distant, sometimes uninvolved at times, but He's always aware, He's always at work, and we can rest in His provision and His grace. He was able to take this situation. It was a bad situation. There were some wrong choices that were made, but God took those and was preparing for the future, and He can do the same with you and I. Next week, Lord willing, we'll look at chapter 3. Maybe we won't spend as much time, but we'll have a look at what transpires in chapter 3.